Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Professor Laurance Splitter's seminar on this topic, why philosophical thinking still matters in education. I think Laurance doesn't need any special introduction. He is a very famous guy at UHK, no matter for what reason. Right? He's very famous here. Maybe he can update us on his happy retirement life. He has just come back from Australia, retired already, and maybe he can tell us something new about his life now before he starts his seminar. So can you join me in giving him a warm welcome before he starts his seminar today?
Thanks, LCM. I have to sit here at the moment because of the, I have to operate this. Actually, because I'm always been fascinated by the concept of identity, I don't know whether I have any history with EDUHK. I have a history with the Institute of Education, but if the Institute of Education is identical to the EDUHK, then I do have a history with the EDUHK. Anyway, not to worry. Look, this is not a formal paper. I hope it's vaguely coherent, and it may or may not be controversial or trivial. I think, well, we'll see anyway. Basically, as I think I might have said in the abstract that was on the poster, the advertisement, I'm one of those philosophers who has always felt a little bit on the periphery, on the edge of things, partly because a number of years ago I moved from traditional philosophy or academic analytic philosophy, which was my background, into education. And well, philosophers in education have been accustomed to being on the periphery in certain ways. Of course, it doesn't help that philosophers don't define themselves very clearly. So who is and who is not a philosopher is also up for grabs. And there are, these days, so many different schools of philosophy. What I'm about to say may in fact be quite offensive to some of you. You may think this is not the way that you actually construe philosophy. But I have a rather old-fashioned view of philosophy and why I think it is important. And that's what I'm going to try and get at today. And I decided to start with a rather famous quote from the empiricist philosopher David Hume. Some of you, of course, will be very familiar, some of you may not. Basically, what he says, well, you can see it, if we take in our hand any volume of divinity, or this was written in from the late 18th century, or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? So is it about logic, pure logic, what we also call analytic work? No, if it doesn't. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matters of fact and existence, which nowadays we would call science and other empirical studies? No. Then commit it to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. So Hume is saying very clearly there that if you have a statement which is neither purely logical, perhaps we can add mathematical, I guess, nor completely empirical, then it's meaningless. And this is linked to something which I think still bothers us today, and that is the so-called distinction between facts and opinions. And I can remember many times, being told and listening to teachers telling kids, make sure you distinguish between facts and opinions so you know the difference, right? And, well, the problem is not that there's no distinction. I'm sure that there are ways to spell this out, although exactly what facts are is another issue. But anyway, the idea is that facts are supposed to be objective, public, verifiable, and opinions are supposed to be subjective and private and unverifiable. But the problem is not looking at the distinction. The problem is thinking that this is an exhaustive distinction. In other words, there's nothing else. Ironically, as I say here, I think seeing it as exhaustive leaves no room for an entire domain of inquiry, including philosophy. So it isn't a matter of this or this. I think there's something else, which is really important. Now, just quickly to kind of, I won't say complete, but to continue the empiricist story into the 20th century, and again, as many of you will know, and I am by no means an expert or a historical expert on this, and I've forgotten most of what I did learn years and years ago. But the famous school of logical empiricism or logical positivism, which included the so-called Vienna Circle and others in Europe and England and America, or mainly in Europe, I guess, was a continuation of a certain kind of empiricist view. The idea was that the only meaningful statements are ones that can be somehow reduced to logic and science. So it was a way of eliminating old-fashioned metaphysics, for example, saying, well, look, really this doesn't mean anything. And various other philosophers, including Wittgenstein and so on, interpreted this in their own way. The philosopher W.V. Quine, a logician, very celebrated philosopher in the 20th century, even argued against the original distinction made by Hume between analytic and empirical statements, claiming that that was a fallacy, one of what he called the dogmas, one of the dogmas of empiricism, which isn't true. But I'm not going to explore that. So, the idea here, which I think a lot of empiricists picked up from Hume onwards, more or less, targeted what we might call the obscurantist views of religious scholasticism. I put religious in brackets because I suspect that in the Middle Ages or in medieval times, that was what most scholasticism was, and it tended to be dogmatic because that was the way in which things were in those days if they were connected with religion, and of course sometimes still are. Indeed, I will make a comment later on, I hope, about the, if you like, the new dogmatism which has descended upon us, particularly in the last year or so, it seems. So I may make some links to that. So certainly there was a rationale for empiricist thinking, that you've got to be able to relate things very closely to our own experience, and if you move too far away from experience, then you'll really end up speaking nonsense. But, as I say here in my view, in its extreme forms, it throws out the baby with the bathwater. It relegates philosophy itself to the meta-language of commentary, rather than having anything really important to say. So, for example, people often think, oh, well, philosophy is good because it helps people think clearly or think more critically. And so you just take some subject, any other subject, and you think well, or you think critically in that subject, and somehow that's a kind of philosophical influence. And I'm hoping that we can perhaps say a bit more about what philosophy can contribute to thinking, and also eventually in education. I'm sorry that I've committed the cardinal sin here of writing too much into a PowerPoint screen. I realise that. I wasn't going to have a PowerPoint at all, but as Mark and I were chatting yesterday, and we agreed that it's always good to have both an oral and a visual stimulus. It's not guaranteed to work, but it helps. So the philosopher who I want to kind of focus on, not again historically or of the theory of Kant, but because I do actually think that Kant was onto something very valuable, and he is in my pantheon of heroes and great sort of thinkers and great human beings. One of the great philosophers, and partly because he could see something correct about empiricism, but also something correct about the opposite, which is called rationalism. And again, I'm not sorry if this seems like a bit of a history lesson. I'm just building up to what I really get into. He recognised Hume as having awoken him from his dogmatic slumbers, whatever that actually means. I don't quite know, but anyway. He was not a classic empiricist, because he thought that experience couldn't, well, that's a sort of unwieldy sentence there. Experience yields the content of what we claim to know, so it gives us the stuff, right? We look around us, we use our senses, we experience the world, and that gives us content. But it can't at the same time provide an adequate ground or justification which would transform what we claim to see or what we claim to experience into genuine knowledge. So in other words, empiricism could not provide a support or a foundation or a ground for itself. You needed something more. Now that in itself might seem rather controversial, because some people might say, well, there is nothing more, right? I was trying to think of a simple, I did think of a simple example, now I've forgotten it. Anyway, let me continue for a minute. He articulated the idea that our knowledge claims, and knowledge, the idea of knowledge and the concept of knowledge, of course, belonging to epistemology, has always been a central part of philosophy. Our knowledge claims, along with all other aspects of our own experience, depend upon a conceptual framework which makes empirical knowledge possible, but is not itself purely empirical. So there's something underlying our empirical knowledge, which in itself is not purely empirical. So concepts like substance, cause, wisdom, truth, goodness, beauty, mind, value exists. What nowadays even kids who I work with, teachers, recognise to be the classic sort of philosophical concepts, that have been around for thousands of years. They're not purely logical concepts in a kind of analytic sense, but neither are they empirical. And similarly for the questions and assertions that employ these concepts. What do we mean by truth? Is it more important to be wise than, I don't know, knowledgeable or whatever? So those sorts of questions also are not entirely empirical questions. These are among the questions, concepts and assertions that we call philosophical. Okay. Where empirical concepts and claims depend upon the contingencies of our experience of the world, so the changeable world that we live in, philosophical concepts and claims can be neither verified nor disproved through experience itself. Something which, again, anyone who has any experience or understanding of philosophy probably realizes. Although, I should add as a kind of little parenthetical comment, again, people know that one of the things about philosophy which either fascinates or appalls people is that every single statement in philosophy is controversial, like contestable. So you can't really say anything and expect that everyone's going to agree with you, even that. I'm saying things here, but of course others may dispute them. But, where am I? Philosophical concepts are not the products of purely logical thinking either. So what kind of thinking or reasoning supports them? And this is where Kant makes one of his most valuable and original contributions by saying there is a kind of thinking or reasoning which he calls transcendental. Now, of course, he wrote in German, so I don't know the original, but transcendental reasoning, if you look it up, it's traced back to Kant. And basically, a reasonable definition is something like this. It's a deductive philosophical argument, so it's meant to be a fairly straightforward step-by-step argument, which takes a manifest feature of experience as given. In other words, the premise you start with in this argument is something which is pretty uncontroversial, something that's very ordinary to us, and articulates that which must be the case, so that that experience is possible. In other words, you start off with something which is quite uncontroversial, and you argue that if this is possible, or if this is the case, then there must be something else underneath that which is true. And in Kant's case, he was arguing for example, some of those fundamental concepts like causality and substance, saying these concepts must be part of our, if you like, intellectual repertoire. If we are to have any experiences at all, which he assumes we do have, then we must already possess these concepts. They don't come from experience, they somehow underlie the experience. Okay. If such thinking can be justified, it allows us to establish claims conceptually, as I put it, not just empirically. These claims will have a stronger element of certainty about them. Now, again, please feel free in the discussion to disagree. That transcends such contingencies as culture and other features of our world that tend to divide us from one another. Now, I'm making a few little leaps and connections in this sentence. Later on, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the view that I hold that culture, religion, nationhood are concepts which, of course, operate in the world today, but I think that they are used where they shouldn't be. And I'll give a couple of examples of that shortly. And part of the reason is because there is a failure to understand that there is a way of arguing, a way of reasoning, which is not purely empirical, but conceptual. So, philosophy in education. I argue that philosophy, and I wasn't sure how to characterize philosophy, so what did I say? Characterize in terms of two things: a cluster of thinking and inquiry tools, and a venerable tradition of attending to the big questions relating to those concepts. So, I argue that philosophy offers a crucial perspective which cannot be represented adequately by the more mainstream background disciplines in education, most notably psychology and the social sciences, because the latter are empirical in nature. And because of what I've just been saying, as empirical disciplines, they lack the resources to examine, let alone to justify their own epistemological, ethical, semantic, and even metaphysical frameworks. A nice abstract and somewhat woolly sentence. But I'll say a bit more about it as I'm going along. For example, what constitutes knowledge? What is knowledge? Knowledge is one of those ideas or frames or concepts which lies at the heart of what students are expected to learn and or construct, depending on the way you see it. Is not an empirical matter. That is, the question of what constitutes knowledge, I'm saying, is not an empirical matter. It cannot be resolved by empirical research procedures. The latter, that is, empirical research procedures, certainly are used to justify or refute specific knowledge claims. But the question of what counts as knowledge is a different matter. And I assert that the neglect of philosophy, now whether it's neglected or not, I suppose depends on your perspective. I often feel neglected, both personally and professionally. So I am very sensitive to the notion of being neglected. But I'm talking, of course, about the neglect of a discipline here, which is, you can talk about what that means. The neglect of philosophy has led to a complacency, for example, about what knowledge is, and therefore which knowledge is important and how it might most effectively be taught. It also allows such dubious dichotomies as what I mentioned before, fact versus opinion. And relatedly, the false dichotomy, as I see it, between knowledge as something external, which has to be transmitted to or imprinted on learners, and knowledge as an internal construction which lacks external or objective validity. You'll be, I'm sure, familiar with the old debate. I don't know whether it's still kind of, going on really, but that either you see what knowledge that the students are supposed to somehow come out with, either it's something which is out there and they somehow have to acquire it, or it's something which is already in there and they have to somehow construct it. And what I'm going to try and give a little bit more flesh to is the idea that that's a false dichotomy. Now, I'm going to give two examples. One is to do with knowledge and the other is to do with ethics. In January, a few months ago, I gave a presentation here, not in this very room, but here, entitled Language and Personhood is Thinking Culturally Relative, in which I argued that the so-called Western view that good thinking requires active participation in a community of dialogue. In other words, good thinking requires language and talking. So to be a good thinker, you have to be a good talker and you have to be involved with others, blah, blah, blah. Should apply to all learners. So you should apply to all learners. I oppose the view that because East Asian students perform as well in high order thinking tasks as their Western counterparts, I'm not sure I put as in, never mind, yet are generally much less active in dialogue. So there are certain facts here. As you would be well aware, most East Asian youngsters and older people are just simply less engaged in dialogue. It's not nearly as central a part of the culture, right, in most East Asian countries. I mean, you can dispute that, but it's an empirical claim, right? So, but I say so the conclusion that's made by some of these researchers is that actually it doesn't matter. They don't need to participate in dialogue. They still do very well in higher order thinking tests and so on and so forth. And I objected to that. That was the talk that I gave in January. One colleague in the fairly lively discussion that followed my presentation, we'll call that colleague Professor X, although his real name was Professor Kerry Kennedy. Sorry he's not here today, never mind. Insisted that despite protestations of mine to the contrary, my conclusion was culturally insensitive and reflected a Western mindset which simply does not apply in other cultural contexts. Concepts such as knowledge and good thinking are, after all, culturally relative. My response is to ask about the kind of argument used to establish the link, in this case, this example, between, say, personhood, who we all are, thinking, talking, and language. What kind of argument is used here? And it was actually out of that sort of interchange that made me think that there's a whole, how can I put it, and I don't want this to in any way sound condescending, but there was a style of argumentation or a style of thinking which is quite familiar to many philosophers, if not most, which I don't think occurs to many people who are not philosophers. It's simply not something which is recognized as a genuine style of thinking because it's not empirically based. Now, I mentioned this in my talk back then. The work of Vygotsky and also, I don't know if Bakhtin was a student or anyway, but and others from that Russian school, as we know, based claims about thinking as internalized conversation, the famous Vygotskian theory, on their empirical studies. I mean, Vygotsky was a psychologist, a philosopher, but also a psychologist. The latter, I would say necessarily, are always confined to this or that specific group or culture. So the conclusions that you get from such empirical studies are likely to be bound by these cultural boundaries. Those like me who believe that the link between powerful thinking and powerful talking is culturally transcendent, I'm deliberately using that word there because I used it before as well, require a different style of argument, that is a transcendental one. Very crowded, sorry. Actually, I did put this quote up when I gave that earlier talk, and I've thrown it around on a number of different occasions. Another person who I venerate philosophically is the 20th century philosopher Donald Davidson, who many of you will not know anything about. He was a student of Quine's, who I mentioned before, but he went in rather different direction from Quine, and I'm not going to try and talk about his work. Here is a better, I won't, instead of reading this paragraph, I'll explain this little diagram, which I've shown been up before. Basically, Davidson's idea is that if, for example, you start off with the idea that each of us has what we might call self-awareness. So when we think about things, we're aware that that we exist, that we have minds, if you want to put it like that. Right? It's not very controversial. I mean, every person, unless they're asleep or comatose or something like that, is aware of themselves in some sense. But we are also aware of others. Others here means others who are doing the same thing as this. In other words, others who are also self-aware, right? And we, all of us here, are aware of a common world. So there's these kind of three types of awareness, if you like. The awareness that I have of myself, the awareness that I have of you, and the awareness that we share of what we might call the world. And Davidson's claim is that all of these are conceptually linked. When you articulate or spell out what this, for example, means, what its components actually mean, I'll give an example in a second, then you realize that it already embraces these other two. So that, for example, knocks out the kind of Cartesian skepticism immediately, because you can't get stuck in your own self-awareness and be a solipsist and say, well, maybe I'm the only thing that exists, because Davidson's claim here, if it's right, is that the very concept of self-awareness actually involves these other two, and each of these involves the other two. So when you understand what each of these means, you actually realize that they're all connected. So, for example, and I'm paraphrasing Davidson a bit here, but because we are aware of things, I mean, in the sense that we see things around us, we use our senses, we experience the world, we form certain beliefs and conjectures about the world, right? And we realize that while many of these will turn out to be true, they may not all be. This is, after all, a key difference between belief and knowledge. So Davidson wants to say, if you know what the difference is between belief and knowledge, which we learn at a very early age, although some of us may not appreciate the difference and think that anything we believe must be knowledgeable, but we pretty much learn that's not necessarily true. How do we learn the difference between belief and knowledge? One of the ways is because we discover that some of our beliefs are not true. We make errors, we make mistakes, and then hopefully if we are reasonable, I'm tempted to say, and if we are not someone, but I won't say that just yet, we will then give them up because they've been discovered to be false. So if you're a reasonable person, you have a belief that's discovered to be false, you'll give it up. And this is a key difference, because if you actually do have genuine knowledge, then the logic, the concept of knowledge itself, at least traditionally, suggests that it can't be false. If it's genuine knowledge, it's been already verified as true. So here's what David says: we would not have the concept of getting things wrong or right if it were not for our interactions with other people. So start off with the idea of being aware of things. This involves concepts like belief, among other things. If you really have the concept of belief and you know what beliefs are, you have to understand that sometimes we say things that are right, sometimes we say things that are wrong. If you have that understanding, then you must get this from interacting with other people. Now, there may be some gaps in that argument. I'm not necessarily trying to make the argument convincing, but I'm giving it as an example of what I'm calling a kind of transcendental argument. Through language, and by the way, this happens, the interactions with other people primarily happen through language. I mean, they're not only through language, but that's how we basically work out which of our beliefs which of my beliefs match yours, and which of our beliefs match what's actually out in the world. Through language, we share our observations and beliefs about the world with others, and we note that from time to time these do not correlate, therefore one of us must be mistaken. I claim that this kind of thinking is a form of transcendental reasoning. To say it again, I guess I kind of just said this. Each of us has an awareness of things. That's the kind of fairly trivial, familiar starting point. And therefore we have certain beliefs about the world. This can be true only because of our linguistic interactions with others about the world we experience. So thinkers are members of a common linguistic community. What I'm getting at here is that if this argument works, it's got nothing to do with where you come from, what your culture is, what your background is. This is a claim about all thinking creatures, in particular persons. You might want to include Martians and so on, but we don't have to worry about that. And furthermore, and I made this claim last time, if you think about that, the other topic, the thing about, say, arguing that East Asian students still do very well on higher order thinking tests, even though they have not been engaged in a lot of dialogue, if there is an argument to show that really good thinking involves dialogue, then there must be something, you would imagine, that these kids and adults as they grow up are missing out on. Now, I'm aware that I'm in a very predominantly East Asian audience, right? So this is something you may or may not want to comment on a bit later. But if this is right, then, and I think this is the kind of thing that someone like Bakhtin, Vygotsky's colleague, made, a point that he made, if you don't spend a lot of time talking with others, and by the way, I shouldn't sound too idealistic about Westerners. I mean, Westerners also don't engage in a lot of dialogue, right? They talk a lot, but they don't engage in what I would call real dialogue. So if you don't do this, then there will be things that you will not be able to do very well. Consider things from multiple perspectives, for example. Realize the complexities of issues, because you need to see a number of different viewpoints and put them together. It is only through complex linguistic interaction with others, I call dialogue, we're able to represent this complexity in our own minds. So I've talked before about dialogue, and it's just what I'm trying to do here is give it as an example of what I'm calling, quote, transcendental thinking. I don't think this is Western or cultural imperialism, unless you actually think that the reasoning itself is relegated to a particular culture. And in other words, it's only Westerners who reason like this, which I think would be a rather strange thing to say. So, anyway, last time, I don't need to mention this, I also snuck in a few quotes from Confucius that suggested that he actually thought very highly of discussion and of being questioned and challenged, which is not the first view that one thinks about when one thinks of Confucian learning. So I thought that was interesting. This is not just a challenge to East Asian thinking, reasoning and talking styles. We seem increasingly to live in a world where rational discourse and a commitment to truth are signs of elitism that are out of touch with the concerns of common folk. Now, of course, you will recognise that this has become very prominent in the last few months, particularly since the US election, right? And I'll say a bit more about this. In this world, the world up here, right, the trend toward internationalisation, and I do need to say something about internationalisation because the department is IELL, right? But I think there are some genuine links here. Internationalisation, not just economic and corporate globalisation, but it's challenged by a more localised, nativist, as it's sometimes called, populist mode of thinking, in which the ills of society can be blamed on them, whoever them is, as defined by whoever gets up and says it. Whether they are in any way actually complicit is beside the point. And you saw this happening, I think, particularly in the US election. Also in the Brexit campaign that was going on now. Of course, I'm saying these things, they may well be disputed, but so let me keep going. The second example I mentioned, the first one was knowledge and thinking. The second one is from morality and ethics. Just to, what do I mean? Want to kind of just remind myself and to reassure myself that ethics historically was always a branch, or at least I think always, I shouldn't say always, but certainly as far as I know, a branch of philosophy. Of course, it was not the only area of thought that dealt with ethics. I mean, religion also dealt with and deals with ethics. But there are reasons why it makes sense to continue to locate ethics, and also I add here moral education, within the domain of philosophy. One is that philosophy contains not just ethics, but logic, epistemology, and aesthetics, among other things. And each of those relate to ethics. I don't need to really read through these, but you can actually, one of the strengths of looking at ethical issues and looking at concepts such as value and all the other ethical concepts, if you like, looking at it in a philosophical way, with a philosophical background, is that you also can bring to bear rules of logic, because you've studied logic, because that's part of philosophy as well. An understanding of epistemology. What kind of claims are made in ethics? Are they subjective or objective? This is a question in meta-ethics. And the link between aesthetics and ethics, well, I suppose this is may seem a little bit more remote, but in fact it has a very long history, and one that I'm not going to talk about much because I wouldn't be able to say very much profound about it, but certainly going all the way back to Plato. The idea of when you really work out what is good and what is right and what is beautiful, it's all the same. In the final analysis, all of those concepts come down to the same kind of thing. And there is something, you can see the idea that when real damage, harm is done, when people are behaving badly, there is something ugly about that. I mean, you could argue about that. Okay. The second thing I want to say about, why the link between philosophy and ethics. The subject of philosophy comprises concepts that help make sense of our experience, including those which allow us to value and evaluate that experience. So they include concepts like right and wrong, or rights, good, bad, fair, cruel, justice, duty, consequences, virtue, familiar ethical concepts. These concepts require reasoning and judgment in their application. But, just as I was arguing before, they are not entirely empirical, because ethical judgments are prescriptive rather than descriptive. Actually, I'm not sure if that should be because I'm really just repeating it. What I basically want to say here, and I'll say it and then make a comment. No amount of purely empirical investigation can validate or refute ethical claims. This is a view which many philosophers would agree with. Some would not, because, as I said, everything is controversial in philosophy, and so even though the traditional distinction between factual claims and moral claims to me seems very powerful, and was noted by people like Hume and so on, there are a number of contemporary philosophers who would reject it. But I believe that this is true. I'm suggesting, and this is not, by the way, original to me, I read something like this in the European philosopher, oh God, I always forget his name, we'll come back to him in a moment. The idea that ethics or ethical claims are in a sense transcendental, in the sense of transcending and helping make sense of human experience and action, irrespective of the actual origins of or narratives behind specific moral concepts and rules in traditions, in religions, in cultures, etc. The issue of justification needs to go beyond these. This means rejecting such claims as, and people say this all the time, right? This is right, well, because it's just part of our culture. I listened very recently to a discussion with some African women talking about the practice of female circumcision. And it's just an example, right? But when asked, how do they justify this? Basically, they just kept saying, well, it's part of our tradition, it's what we do. And also the claim that's sometimes made by individuals and sometimes by governments, we have no right to judge the beliefs, values and actions of other cultures, or if you like, stay out of our internal affairs. I'm saying that these claims are problematic because they're assuming that we have no, these domains of culture and nationhood and so on are somehow create barriers, but what I'm suggesting is that ethics in fact goes beyond those barriers. A concept which provides a good fit with ethics, and I've talked about this before, is that of personhood. I mean, it's a familiar concept. We're all persons here, right? There's an affinity. All persons are bound by moral claims and entitlements, and only persons are so bound. This may be a little bit controversial. We do not expect that, bottles and desks and so on have any moral obligations, and this is where it gets a bit less trivial, rights or entitlements. When it comes to animals, there are sort of very interesting things to say there, but even there you could argue that it's not a matter of rights that they have because they're not persons. What you must do there is to reduce their suffering. So there's obviously complexities and borderline cases, but there is an affinity between persons and morality. We see this reflected in most theories of what is right and wrong, not just within philosophy, but actually within religion as well. And I've made this claim, but I'm not sure that it's entirely true, but I'm willing to claim that if you take a random philosopher, or, well, I'll say philosopher to start with, who has a view about ethics. So it could be Kant's view about deontology, or Mill's view about utilitarianism, or virtue ethics in character, or Aristotle, or whatever. The claims that they make are implicitly intended to apply to all persons. So implicit they don't even say so. It would be absurd to think, oh well, Kant was German, and he was obviously only writing about Germans. That wouldn't make sense, right, as I see it. And I would say the same about views and theories that I know almost nothing about. For example, traditional Chinese views of ethics. If Confucius had something, and other great Chinese philosophers had something to say that was profoundly right, for example, about ethics, then I would suggest that they would apply to all of us, because that's what ethics is about. And of course you may well find that, and I think you may well find that what Confucius says in some areas does match very closely what other Western philosophers have said anyway. So, now whether this can be said in religion is perhaps a different issue. I may perhaps be just wrong to say it. Certainly I'm Jewish, and there was a time when I was a little bit more observant than I am now. And there are a lot of commandments in traditional Judaism, in fact 613 according to the tradition, right? And some of those seem to be rather specific and exact and very strange, to do with the kinds of food you eat and all sorts of strange things, you know. Some of them have disappeared throughout, you know, in history. Some of them are still around. One question which I will not talk about now, but raise at least, is whether these are ethical rules or whether they are, if you like, the rules of the club. If you want to belong to this club, this is what you've got to do, right? We're not claiming that these are necessarily true for everybody. But on the other hand, I think there are also claims that religions do make, which are intended to be deeply moral claims. And then I can't resist the implication that they are meant to apply to all of us if they are genuinely moral claims. So it's just the same thing. I made a thing down here, I just put it in before. One liberation movement should have sufficed. What I mean by that is, it occurs to me that, and again I'm no historical scholar of this, but if you think about the various liberation movements that occurred, particularly in the US, you know, in the last century, but other places as well. I'm thinking of feminist, you know, the fights for women's rights, women's voting rights, and so on, and then black rights, and then gay rights, and so on, right? In a sense, I've always thought the issues are the same. It's about treating people, as persons. And if only we could have done it the first time, instead of having to keep doing it, you know, it sort of would have saved quite a lot of anguish and suffering. Okay, not long to go. Transcendental thinking and reasoning, as I'm calling it, may or may not be universalizable, but they compel us to go beyond what is given to something deeper and more compelling. These ways of thinking are worth keeping in mind when considering specific areas such as teaching and learning, moral education, in international context, that is, contexts which cross cultural and other contingent boundaries. So I guess what I'm saying, which may be either trivially true or totally unacceptable, is that work in international education needs to respect, well, first of all, learn about, and then respect what goes on in different parts of the world, in different cultural and other contexts. It doesn't follow from that, however, that they have to agree with them, particularly when they make moral claims. Now, I should have said here, because I think I said before, I don't want this to sound like any kind of Western imperialism. I'm not saying it's the claims of Western thinking that are correct. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that there are claims which need to be examined wherever they come from. And, you know, by all means, bring in as many different traditions and cultures as possible, but bringing them in is just the starting point. You then have to engage in what you might call a process of inquiry, sort out which one makes sense. Such familiar but complex strategies as empathy challenge us to make connections with others, where these others could be persons from centuries ago or from different religions, cultures, sexualities, but of course not spiders or rocks. So it's pretty extensive, but doesn't include every single thing. Additional food for thought. Events over the past year have illustrated the power of mass or popular opinion and of those who are, quotes, clever enough to exploit it. But they also reflect a kind of intellectual impoverishment, which threatens to demean and trivialize what it means to be persons in the world. Now, again, this may be something which I don't want to, I'll venture to suggest most people in the room would probably strongly agree with, but there are many people out there who would strongly disagree. But what I want to say is, if you look at this from a philosophical perspective, and I'm thinking particularly of the last well, say year actually, in the US election campaign, where we saw some incredible things happen, and where so many of us thought that each time something absurd happened in the Trump camp, this was another nail in his coffin, right? And so that's why the result was so astounding, so incredible, because it signals or reflects some of these things. A lack of rationality, all right? It's easy to say that, right? A failure to look for plausible causes and consequences. For example, people asking, why are we poor? Why have we missed out? Why are we whatever? And then looking over there instead of looking where they should look. For example, like, you know, corporatization or capitalism. No, they would rather, or they can be easily persuaded to blame immigrants or to blame whoever, okay? A lack of reasonableness. Well, reasonableness is a kind of a way of being decent and civil, I guess, and the rejection of reasoned discourse. Not just abandoning the truth, but abandoning the very commitment to truth. Lies simply don't matter. So even when presented with a lie, we, or I say we, but, you know, could claim, well, I never said that in the first place, but he did, and it's there for everyone to see. But it turned out that a whole lot of people didn't care, right? They didn't care that there were these blatant contradictions. So, and in speaking of contradictions, giving up a commitment to consistency, which is what I think we saw, is a very dangerous thing. Consistency in what we say and consistency between what we say and do. In formal logic, as some of you are no doubt aware, the statement P and not P, which is the classic form of a contradiction, entails Q, and Q can be anything. So if you contradict yourself or land in an inconsistency, the problem with that is that from that anything can follow. And I suggest, if it's not drawing too, what do you call it, long a bow or whatever, one of the reasons people, particularly in America, are absolutely unclear as to what's going to happen when Trump becomes president is because of something like this, right? There have been so many contradictions and backdowns and so on, that what could happen is Q, where Q could be anything. So it really is a very, what shall I say, scary times in some ways. The blame game. Oh, this is the last one. After Brexit and the US election, there has been much finger pointing. I want finally then to point mine at systems of so-called education. Because, and this in itself may sound elitist, it's not meant to, but one of the things which I at least, and I suspect many of you, think schooling should do at the very least, is to teach young people to think properly and to think for themselves. And when you see what's happened in the world in the last 12 months, and maybe it's over a longer period in many other places, you realize that in that respect, say in a country like the USA, education has been a fundamental failure. It has not taught people to think, because the way in which they do reason, in fact, is clearly flawed, right? I mean, that's not meant to be a politically biased statement, it's just there. And anyway, so, and so they've actually betrayed the ideals of democracy, including their own democracy, by failing to think for themselves, which to me, so in a sense, schools and educators have some part to play in that as well. I didn't make any comments about how that might work in this part of the world, but still, you can think about that. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very insightful presentation, Laurance. And colleagues, now we have the Q&A session for about half an hour. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to raise them now. Mark?
Thanks, Elsie, and thanks, Laurance. Can I ask you to go to 17, slide 17, because there was something I missed there. Yeah, when you say that through our awareness we form certain beliefs, we realize that some aren't true, but Davidson's point is that we wouldn't have the concept of getting things wrong or right if we're not for our interactions with other people. Through language we share our argument. But if you go back to the previous slide, Davidson is arguing that's a triangle. There's also awareness of a common work. I'm not sure that common is important for what I want to ask you about. If you go back to 17, you can surely realize you're wrong simply by bumping your head up against empirical reality. It doesn't take anybody else to interact with, to realize that something that you've conjectured might be wrong. You could think that the embers of the fire over there are cool enough, and you walk on them with bare feet, and you figure that they're not. That didn't take anybody.
So, okay. So are there any other types of assertions or beliefs where we realize our mistake, but only when we do indeed interact with others and what others believe? I mean, I'm asking because I take what you're saying. Clearly Davidson thinks that, as he says, it's a quote, we wouldn't have the concept of getting things right or wrong if it were not for our interactions with other people. Is that, can we see some plausibility in that? Because as you point out, there are certain things we could surely discover for ourselves by simply, for that you only need two parts of the triangle, right? Us, this bit, this and this. But what would we need interactions with other people for to show us where we might be mistaken? I'm just throwing the question back, that's all. I'm not, yes.
You did say, Laurance, when you said this slide to us, you did say there's only one way is that we would not have the concept now. It was really that one way that I wanted to press on it a little bit to say, surely he's acknowledging the simple fact of bumping up against the empirical reality.
Yes, and you're right to raise this, and I fear that I'm not going to be able to sort of adequately counter it, and it's a good point. It's a very important point because it's connected to the whole idea that experience itself, in a way, can't always correct itself, even though there are many cases where it seems to do that. There must be some cases where we need something else, and in particular, the way in which we engage with others who have also experienced the world in their way. I should be much more sharp about this and think of a situation in which realising that something is mistaken only happens when you interact with others. So I'll think about this as we're going on. Because it's important, I mean, you're right.
Perhaps that's just not what he's talking about, and that's it. Perhaps because he said, what you're saying, you form certain beliefs and conjectures about the world. Perhaps these more elementary, simple, empirical beliefs are not what he's talking about when he's talking. Maybe he's talking about social.
Well, certainly he would say, and so would other writers from a similar tradition, such as Strawson, that concepts themselves can only be intelligible if they are part of a community of speakers and thinkers. I mean, they have to be shared around. This is like Wittgenstein's famous sort of argument against private language. You know, that language, you may think you can make up your own language and it applies only to things you say, but in fact it ends up being incoherent. The language forces you to be part of an interactive framework with others, so those others have got to be there in some sense. Not an argument, but yeah. So, yeah. Sorry, I'm not saying very much that's helpful there. Yes, I don't know if anyone wants to comment on the example that I went back to from when I gave the talk last time about engaging students here or people here in dialogue. Just because I spent 7 years here and tried in my own way to create these kind of environments, but it clearly was difficult. And you can see how, if you really do think that, if you really want to take concepts of culture and so on seriously, then you can see the argument that, well, you've got to respect the fact that there are different cultures and things do happen differently. And so I'm kind of making this rather bald claim, I suppose, that I actually don't respect cultures very much, in the sense that, maybe just to provoke someone into saying something. I mean, culture is a very tricky thing to define, right? But, and no doubt there are aspects of culture which are important, but I can't help but think that for many people it tends to mean the superficial things that we can do that somehow show where we come from, whether it's how we dress or what we cook or whatever. If you dig deeper and try and get into, if you like, the moral domain, then I think you're on much more dangerous ground because, and you hear this again, I mean, in Australia, and you, no doubt every country, I guess here too, but certainly we talk about, these are, if you come to Australia, because part of the ongoing, not immigration, but certainly the big political battles that are happening over asylum seekers and refugees and so on. And one of the views is that if you come to this country, you've got to be prepared to accept our values. And I always ask, either myself or someone else, well, what exactly are these values that are ours that somehow don't belong to anyone else? And I contend that they're either fairly superficial or they're actually universal. So that the real values of a country, of a tradition, of a culture are actually shared by all people, or should be. That's, you know, I'm just an old-fashioned universalist.
Keep you into the world of education, and it's a quote from a class we've started teaching a master's level class here today. And one of the students made the comment that he chose to come to do the master's program here because he wanted to improve his critical thinking skills. Now, I've interrogated students at the Ho Chi Minh City campus of RMIT, where I work, as well about their reasons for choosing to go to RMIT in Ho Chi Minh City. And a frequent refrain is because I want to learn how to think critically, and it's cheaper to go to RMIT in Ho Chi Minh City than RMIT in Melbourne. So there is something that's recognised about education systems, that they do. We are supposed to be teaching people to think critically. So
yeah, yes. Now I suppose. So it wasn't about a particular university. It could have been most. Yeah, going to a university.
Going into any university. Yeah.
Well, I guess if you wanted to be sort of difficult with such a person, you could ask them what they mean by critical thinking. That would be one thing, because that in itself is quite a, it's both a technical term, but also one that's part of the common language now. And there are so many different understandings from psychology, philosophy, and other areas about what critical thinking actually is. So that would be one thing to sort of upset someone. And what do you actually mean? They may mean think better,
Oh, in the case of the Vietnamese students, it was we were taught to think for ourselves in our education system, and so we need a different exposure.
But then, and I hate to say this because it might seem rather trite, you can then ask them what they actually think thinking for oneself actually means, right? Certainly, I think one thing that we know that is involved in these kinds of thinking is being reflective, being aware of your thinking. What we do with young kids when we do philosophy with them is to try and get them to become self-aware so that they can take the time to look at that. So that's certainly something. But, and I guess going back to the US situation, I think they did establish that a lot of the people who ended up supporting the president-elect had less education for what it's worth. Now, I don't know, but so if I'm being a critic, I'm talking about schools. I mean, I don't think what you might call critical or better thinking, or I sometimes call it powerful thinking, we can't afford to let it wait until university, right, or a master's course. It's just,
William?
Laurance, you seem to be, I mean, you mentioned that you yourself is a moral universalist. So you believe that only, I mean, if a value is worthwhile, justifiable, it would be applicable in all, I mean, everywhere.
I must admit that I am inclined to believe that, yes, so shoot it down. I mean, seriously, I mean, I know it's not, it's an old-fashioned view of...
I wonder how you would respond to some typical argument raised by cultural relativists. I mean, they will be arguing from another direction, saying something like, we cannot make transcultural moral criticism because you do not know what they are doing, for example. So if people who believe in the value of feet binding, the value of penal circumcision, or some other cultural practices, are doing something which are unique and important to protect their own society or to be a worthy person. So what reason do you have to object to this kind of practice?
Okay, well, I guess you do need to have reasons, right? Because otherwise it would fall more into the category of what I was calling the trivial or the superficial. If people want to dress in a way or whatever that doesn't have... But I take it that there are verifiable harm, there is verifiable harm that can be caused by things like female circumcision. Foot binding I'm not as familiar with. I assume it's the same. So certainly you're right about one thing. Someone from outside that group or that culture or that society would have to be extremely careful about jumping in and making claims. But that's an epistemological point, isn't it? I mean, you need to be well informed and you need to go and look at what's going on. And if you make claims about harm and damage, you need to be very sure that you've got your facts right. It could be, for example, that, I mean, some people, different, what's the word, racial, ethnic, whatever groups, sometimes there are physiological differences. Maybe certain things can happen in other cultures because harm isn't caused as a matter of physical fact. I don't think that's true in these cases. So, you said that one of the defences is something that I kind of read out in a rather disparaging way. People who say, but this is what we do. This is an important part of our culture. And I wrote a whole book where I tried to say that when it comes to the well-being of persons, as opposed to the well-being of things like cultures, societies, and even nations, to me, I know which one's more important. Persons are more important. So if something, just because something, and I mean, a classic example, I know this is perhaps, a bit unfair, William, but honour killings, which we know still take place in some societies. Now, it is so easy to sit here as a Westerner and, look at examples from other societies. there are also examples in the other direction, no question, right? So it's not about one society or culture versus another, it's a different kind of claim. So I would like to, yeah, I mean, I would like to hear a serious claim in defense of cultural relativism that doesn't just say this is what we do. I mean, or is based on, you did say one thing, and that is people outside the culture can never know or might never know what's actually going on there, and that, I don't know, I mean, I don't see why we can't. And, yeah, and maybe in that case, talk to the people in the culture, you know, talk to them about why do you do this, and hope that they might say, because presumably if this is attached to a value, or is something which is not just a practice, but which has value, it's something they believe is correct, they not only want to do it, but they believe it's the right thing to do, they should be able to tell you why it's the right thing to do, not just this is what we do. Right? And that's what we'd like to hear, isn't it? It's the right thing to do because. Now, no doubt, in the case of female circumcision, I think it's factually correct that part of the culture, the tradition here, is that if you put this delicately, I mean, it's the old men and women thing, you know, men are allowed to run around and, you know, do all sorts of things, but women have to be sexually controlled and contained, otherwise there was going to be trouble, and this is one way of doing it. I'm sorry if that's not the right thing, but I think it's certainly part of it historically. And then, so okay, so suppose that comes up, you know, people, and we know, actually there are other classic examples if you want to look at that sort of example, the much more prominent, well, I'd say much more, but certainly in many Western societies, it's causing a lot of angst, and that is the appropriateness of allowing Islamic women to cover themselves, not just a little bit, but completely. And it is very interesting to read and to hear about some of the objections that people have to this, you know, and some of them seem to me to lack plausibility and are just silly and awful, but some may make more sense. But the question is what, the question would be, let's first of all understand why they're doing this and what's important about it. And there too, because I know from Orthodox Judaism, where there is something similar but not as drastic, which is that Orthodox Jewish women, when they're outside, wear wigs. And the wig, you can look at it instantly and say that's a wig. It's not meant, as I understand it, to be a fashion statement. It's meant actually almost as the opposite. It's meant to be a statement that I am for my husband, thank you very much, so stay away. And I don't want you to be attracted to me. Now that's not so different, you know. So what I'm trying to get at, sorry, long-winded, is that I would like to believe that people of any age just about could have a discussion about this, let's call it a dialogue, that would be a mutually respectful one. That would say, so what does that say to you about, for example, is this about what, you know, the assumption is that we can do nothing about the male, whatever it is, you know, libido or something, you know, that women therefore have to fall into line. And that's a discussion that could be held, you know, irrespective of culture and so on. I mean, it's an important, good discussion to have. And if some of us believe that, well, actually it's men who need to, you know, think about their behaviour, well, so be it. I think we should be prepared to say that, not just men in this culture or that culture, but men. Anyway, yeah.
Laurance,
Yeah.
considering the non-empirical character about philosophy you have emphasized in the beginning part of your presentation, I was wondering how you would respond to the trend in the past decade that more and more philosophers are trying to study philosophical problems, especially ethical problems, by using empirical methods. They call themselves experimental philosophers. Maybe you have heard about that. This trend is growing, you know. I just want to know how you respond to those.
I think in the philosophy of mind there's been something similar with the growth of what's called cognitive science, right? I mean, I think there's a whole stream of philosophy. I am bewildered, I don't know if bewildered is a bit strong. I am puzzled by it. I don't quite, I mean, I think we certainly can laugh at the old image of the armchair philosopher who would sit there and make all these great claims, right, without ever looking around, okay? But having said that, I am not sure what happens to philosophy. yeah, basically I'm not knowledgeable enough. So you may be able to help us with a bit more detail here about what experimental philosophy looks like.
Just like one example.
Yeah.
If Hong Kong people wants to know whether gay marriage should be legalized in Hong Kong, maybe an experimental philosopher will go to the streets to interview the people there and try to collect data from them, and then using some empirical analysis to find out whether we should do it. This is a question.
But there's a very obvious response to that, and that is that there's nothing particularly philosophical about doing that, right? I mean, lots of people can do that and probably do it better because they're trained in you know, quantitative whatever methodology, sociology and so on, right? So what would still be specifically philosophical about doing that, other than drawing the conclusion that that's what people should do? But then, I don't know, yeah, I mean, is that?
That's also my query.
Yeah.
I don't know what they are doing actually. Yeah, but
I mean, it's certainly true, isn't it, that without even knowing too many details, in the last 150 years or so, I mean, the rise of the postmodernist and then whatever has followed that, you know, certainly challenged and so on a lot of the old. I mean, I hear myself representing a form of philosophy which is rather quaint and old-fashioned, analytic philosophy. I can't get past it because to me, philosophy is the study of concepts, and that's not an empirical domain.
maybe Chima first, and then go back to you, Mark.
Yes, I just try to share two feedbacks. The first one is I'm thinking about Kierkegaard differentiation.
Kierkegaard, yeah.
So he differentiates truth into objective and subjective truth. And what concerning with us here seems to, I don't know, fall into mainly objective truth, not necessarily in terms of so-called objective knowledge, science, things like that, but the religious, inner religious experience he is concerned with, and it relates to his idea of subjective truth. And well, I have no further thought on that, but I just make a comment on make a feedback for that, which is the first one.
Right.
The second one is concerning with the cultural or cognitive relativism. That I'm thinking of a book written by George Lakoff. That one of his book is called Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things, and it is a very famous book concerning with if we are talking about categories, cognitive categories, then there would have some anthropological findings that the other people think in the other way around or relate things differently, so that they have very different categories to think about good, for example, or dangerous. And so I'm thinking that the debate on what is right and wrong on human behavior and making some comments would go endlessly, because we have different clubs in the world, as you say. Although we are persons, I agree with you. So that the way how we come to something quite definitely so-called truth is still a long way. And I think I'm thinking of, even in the Chinese context, the way of thinking is always regarded as so-called relational. So it is not necessarily a very egoistic or a very individualistic way. And so that thinking in a community or language we use is necessarily share something that we become we already a person, whatever the culture we come from. So that I agree with you.
Well, this is going to sound very silly, but you should read my book, because I agree with that last statement.
Yeah.
I think that seeing ourselves as relational beings is the compromise, is the best balance between individualism, which to me is, and collectivism, right? There's another way to go. Now your point about, I suppose with the cultural relativism, and I suppose because I'm thinking about classrooms and young people particularly. In places like Australia, you have a lot of so-called multicultural classrooms. I think it would just be great if kids from representing different viewpoints could express their viewpoints and talk to each other, and even to the point of trying to persuade each other. And there may be some, hopefully not conflict, but certainly maybe some give and take along the way. I mean, to me, and again, am I a good proponent of this? I'm not sure, probably not. One of the things that's really missing from debate and discussion and whatever, that stops it from being what I call dialogue, all over the place, is not so much that people don't know how to argue for their positions. Many people know how to do that. Is that they don't know how to back down and say, oh, I was wrong, or I have to rethink that, or yes, I realise what you're saying. You know, I mean, that's something which none of us like doing. Again, one can't help but think about the US situation now. But certainly that, from a very young age, I would love kids to be taught that it's okay, in fact more than okay. It's how we progress, you know, by realising that we help each other. On the first point now, I know not very much about Kierkegaard. It comes up in Monty Python jokes. But I admit that I had a very one-sided education when I was at Oxford. But the thing about subjective truth, right? I mean, if you like it, the kind of answer that someone from my kind of background would give is something like this. If you're dealing with objective, then you can say, there's a clear distinction between saying, it seems to me that blah, and blah. It seems to me that blah, and blah is true. There's a difference, because my seeming may be wrong. It's like a belief and knowledge, right? So if it's in the objective realm, I may think this, but it may be wrong. Now, if it's in the so things that I claim and believe may not be true. But in the subjective realm, that distinction disappears, right? I mean, that's what's troubling about it.
Yes.
There is no difference between saying this is how it seems to me, and this is how it is to me, right? So the notion of truth is not doing very much. Now, this I'm not saying about Kierkegaard, so I don't know exactly what. I know that he was a pretty smart guy, right? So I'm sure he would say something about that.
Yeah, just because the Buddhist, for example, Buddhist monk, would say enlightenment, and what they say about that is subjectively.
Okay, yeah,
enlightened.
Fair enough. Yes, and I admit that I don't quite get that. Yeah. Mark, you were going to say something?
You were going to say something?
Yeah, but I put something.
No. Maybe you first.
One of your slides later on made it pretty clear that your concept of relational beings excluded spiders and rocks. Now, I think the people like Latour and active network theory and
What, sorry?
Bruno Latour's work on active network theory.
I hate it when I make the feeling word. Sorry, you have to tell me before.
And more recently, there's people who refer to themselves as new materialists that emphasise the importance of interactions and interactions with matter and material beings and non-human beings. So there's a need to kind of take them into account in the way we interact with them in our thinking.
Yeah, well, I hope I didn't say that you can't relate to spiders and rocks. What was the exact context of that? It was about morality, wasn't it? It was about.
I think you're really sort of making a strong sort of dichotomy between people as relational beings and spiders and rocks.
But ethically, I mean, okay, even allowing for the great importance of environmental movements and so on, I agree that that's problematic. But ethically, there is, I don't know how you escape from the huge difference between, you know, harming and destroying a person and harming and destroying a rock or a spider. Am I being too trivial here? I mean,
Can I push you a bit, because you know Peter Singer's work well, and Peter Singer will not run with you on a strict distinction, dichotomy between humans and animals. He's made good arguments to show that a sentient animal and a fairly intelligent one, like a baboon or a dolphin, may be more conceptually sophisticated,
Okay.
what's the word I'm looking for, than an infant, and any normal infant, and also an adult who may be severely mentally
In
compromised.
chapter 6 of my book, yeah, go on. Two comments. The first is that, from my understanding of Peter Singer, and I don't know that his views on this have changed a lot over the years, but perhaps they have, but certainly his earlier view, he himself would concede that creatures that we should care about because they could suffer, for example, like hens in a whatever, are not persons and do not have rights. Do not have rights. It's not the rights that protect them, it's the fact that they can suffer, and we should not cause them needless harm, right? That's one point. The second point is that I totally agree that it's worth distinguishing between person and human being. And that from what you were just saying, it's open to that. We, when I was running the GE Foundation Corps, we used to show this video of, I used to show this video when I was giving the lectures, of experiments with dolphins, that they would argue that they have self-awareness by putting a mark on their forehead and watching what happens. The dolphins will notice themselves in mirrors and will sometimes just play around, amusing themselves like a little kid might when they first discover a mirror, right? Whereas apparently, and these are the empirical claims, right, cats and dogs don't notice themselves in mirrors, at least not nearly to the same extent. Elephants do, chimpanzees do, and dolphins do. Suppose you take this to a real, keep going with this and argue that they're persons. Now, to me, this would actually come down to something quite controversial, and that is, to me, they'd have to have language. And I don't just mean a few grunts here and there, right? I mean, and I don't know that that's going to be established, but suppose it were established, that's fine. Then it's not just human beings, it's human beings and other persons, such as dolphins. I have no problem with that. My claim is not about human beings, it's about persons. Because there might even be Martians and maybe robots. Then, yeah.
Can you explain why having language is so important for a species to be regarded as a person?
Yes, well, we've talked about it.
Okay.
No, I mean, yeah, of course, it's, I do put my, what's the word, I stake a lot of what I believe on that claim. I know others do, but that's hardly an argument. Yes, why do I think of language being the kind of almost the sine qua non? I suppose it's a bit connected to the old Aristotelian idea that persons are rational creatures. Then you add to that the Vygotskian, Davidsonian type view that rationality actually means you have to be in a language community. So you kind of end up with something. And the good thing about language as opposed to rationality is that you can see it and you can study it. And we know why it occurs in some creatures and not others, and that's because of the size of their brains. We know how language is generated. So, but is that an adequate answer to your question? Probably not. Certainly, I guess another way of thinking of it, which is in line with what I was talking about, persons being conceptual creatures, and my view of concepts is that really, if you look behind language, I don't mean English or Spanish or Chinese, but if you look behind language, you won't find anything, right? They're not sitting there in the mind or whatever. So the concepts are very closely linked to language, so again, that would be another way of trying to sort of articulate it. But
Excuse me, due to the limitation of time, I think we need to end our discussion here. Thank you again for coming to our research
thank you very much.
seminar.
Yeah.
And thank you again, Laurance, for being us. Thank you. I can see you very soon, especially in the coming research seminars. The coming one is on Wednesday, to be presented by Professor Mark Mason.
Oh no, that's not a research
And also-
seminar. No, it's
TNL seminar, or just a sharing seminar?
no, it's the report on international student exchanges and stuff.
But I saw the poster everywhere, right? Anyway,
Tsinghua and I.
Tsinghua.
That's not research by any means.
well, hang on.
It should be enjoyable.
Yeah, research, I mean, we need to have a fairly broad content. I was mine in that sense, yeah.
thank you for having me. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
I've got 20 minutes.
Tell me, sorry, Annette. I mean, I'm just hopeless, you know. I look at myself in the mirror sometimes and think, who the hell's that, you know?
If you see a dot on your forehead, you must not keep
Well,
worrying.
were you at Monash?
What's taken now, RMIT?
Oh, because, okay, Mark.
Yeah.
Because I think you wrote, when I was editing a series of books with ACR, you wrote one of those.
Yes, yes.
See you tomorrow.
So, oh yes, LCM, same school, right? Same time, same school. So you're based where now?
Well, RMIT.
Oh, okay.
I'm
But-
emeritus at RMIT.
Okay, but you spent some time in Vietnam, you
Yeah, oh, because of our campus setting.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But no, we're